When Patrick and Jessica find a baby on their doorstep, they end up adopting him after the police can't find where he came from. But adopting a child without knowing anything about them or where they come from is always a risk, and the couple will face this when their adopted child grows up. When they finally find out why he stayed behind with them, his life will never be the same again. When the police knocked on their door that afternoon, Patrick and Jessica were already fearing the worst. And when the officer revealed that it was his son Ken, these fears were immediately confirmed. They had been praying that this day would never come. But here it was. They called Ken downstairs, and without any problem, he let himself go. Now that he had learned the truth about his parents, and why they had left him behind so many years ago, he knew the time would come when the police would pick him up. Patrick and Jessica were scared by what was about to happen, but they knew it was out of their hands. It was all up to Ken now. But why did the police come to pick up Ken? Who were his real parents? And why did he stay with Patrick and Jessica when he was a baby? When Patrick and Jessica woke up to the doorbell ringing in the middle of the night, the last thing they expected to find was a baby. But while Patrick was completely stunned by the discovery, his wife Jessica almost pushed him out of the way to pick up the little boy and comfort him. As he did so, he insisted that Patrick take a look around the neighborhood to see if he saw anyone still leaving. Maybe they could still find the person who left the unknown baby at their doorstep. But all Patrick found was one of his neighbors walking his dog. And all that neighbor had seen was a small car speeding away from his home address. But in the dark, he couldn't even tell Patrick the color. Patrick returned home disappointed. Jessica had already put the baby back to sleep. They would call the police in the morning. The police saw the act of leaving the child at someone's door as child neglect and took the case very seriously. They came to the house that same day to take statements from Patrick and Jessica and check the neighborhood to see if they could find any clues about the parents of this baby. But things seemed difficult from the start, and with the knowledge, the police had to give Patrick and Jessica a difficult decision to make. During the time the research lasted, they could choose to give the baby to foster care, or they could raise the baby themselves. But while Patrick was in doubt, Jessica's mind was already decided. I would take care of this baby for as long as it takes. She had dreamed of being a mother since she was a child, but she was deathly afraid of childbirth. This felt like the universe threw a golden opportunity into its lap. And it wasn't long before she convinced Patrick as well. I still hoped very much that the baby's parents would be found sooner rather than later, and that this would only be temporary. But he would be proven very wrong with these assumptions, since even though the police tried their best, their search led to nothing. After a few months of activating the search and working on the case, the police had to put it on the back burner because there were simply no more leads to follow. The officer in charge of the case asked Patrick and Jessica again if they wanted to keep the baby. But this time, it will most likely be a lifetime commitment. But after 2 months of bonding with this incredibly sweet baby, it was one of the easiest decisions for Patrick and Jessica. There was no way they would give up this addition to the family, so they went from being adoptive parents to adopting the baby. A decision with many unforeseen consequences for their future. Years passed, and Patrick and Jessica enjoyed every second of being parents to their beautiful adopted son, Ken. He was growing up to be the seemingly perfect kid. Friendly, well-behaved, and very intelligent for his age. The couple felt like they had hit the jackpot, but one day, everything seemed to change for them. Patrick and Jessica were able to pinpoint the exact moment when Ken began to change for the worse. It was around his 12th birthday. Patrick and Jessica had determined that it was a good time to tell Ken that he was adopted and that they found him on their doorstep. They had never intended to be anything but honest about this with him, but maybe they should have thought more about this, or at least waited until he was a little older, as it quickly became apparent that Ken didn't take this revelation well. He began to talk less to his parents, worry less about school, and generally become more withdrawn. He became obsessed with discovering the truth about himself. He wanted answers as to why he was left behind in that way. And most of all, he wanted to know who his real parents were because, even though Patrick and Jessica had raised him as Ken, they now felt like imposters, and he wasn't afraid to leave him. They know this. All this put the couple in a very difficult position. They wanted to help their son discover the truth, but they had no idea how. And they also worried that this pursuit would only push them further apart as a family. And they didn't even have a click yet. What a shocking truth they would discover about why Ken stayed behind with them. Patrick was trying to help Ken a little bit at first, even taking him to the police to see if he could see his case at that point. Even though the police had never found his parents, perhaps they still had some information that could give the boy some sort of closure. But Ken was going to be very disappointed by what he found. The police didn't have a shred of information. They didn't seem to have discovered anything about Ken, and they obviously did a lot of research, judging by the reports. They looked like his real parents, and their motivations were really impossible to trace. Or were they? On the way home, Ken didn't say a word. Patrick hoped that he would be the one to accept the reality of the situation. Chances are, he'd never find his real parents, so maybe now he could start accepting him and Jessica as such. But again, Patrick was very wrong about this. When he and Jessica woke up the next morning, their worst fears came true. Ken was gone. No notes. Nothing but a lot of his clothes and other possessions were gone. He had run away from home, and the couple did not hesitate for a second to call the police for help. Given the context behind Ken's disappearance, the police had no doubt that the boy had run away from home and saw no use in waiting for him to show up again. They put his description on local news stations, and everyone was told to keep an eye out for him. Police interviewed Patrick and Jessica extensively to find out if they had any indication of where Ken was headed. And while they knew exactly who he was looking for, they had no idea where he was going to look for them. They thought he had no idea where his parents were. But Ken knew something they didn't. The police could search for him as much as they wanted, but he was not even in the city anymore. The night he left his house, he was picked up by a car in front of his house. It was a small black car. The same one Patrick's neighbor had seen speeding out the night baby Ken stayed in the house. And it was no accident that that car was ready to pick him up that night. Everything had been arranged the day before without Jessica and Patrick knowing, and they could possibly have no idea when and how this was planned. It all happened when Ken was disarmed for a moment at the police station so he could take a look at the old evidence book. Something Patrick didn't think much about at the time. He thought that if there was anything there worth knowing, otherwise the police would have already followed up on that lead. Ken had other ideas. There was something in the old test book, a phone number. Ken memorized it quickly. The police had tried to track down the number a long time ago, but they never found anything. The technology wasn't that good, and no one had thought about researching it since. But Ken had that number now and knew what he was going to do with it. Ken called the number later that night. The phone rang only once before it was answered. Ken and the mysterious man on the other end of the phone talked for a while, and then Ken disappeared. Now his parents were very distraught, and Ken was nowhere to be found. But things were about to change. Jessica and Patrick were very worried. They continued to talk to the police, going over everything that had happened recently. The police were about to calm Ken's parents when he showed up at the door. Ken had come home. But why? Everyone was stunned. Ken was immediately bombarded with questions. He kept telling everyone that he had gone for a walk that night and hadn't made it home until now. He said he needed to clear his mind and figure things out. That was his story, at least. While no one really believed Ken's story, they left it as it was. The police stopped the search for him because he was no longer missing, and the police officers returned to the station. It seemed that everyone was satisfied for the moment, but not everything sat well with an officer. Once all the cops left, Jessica and Patrick sat down with their son and demanded answers. There were no more laps around the problem. They had to know what had happened. Her son couldn't just walk away and disappear like that without telling her. They had been very worried. But was Ken ready to talk? Having gone through so much, Ken's parents were beyond surprised when he agreed to talk to them. He trusted them enough to tell them his big secret, but only on one condition. They couldn't stop him from going ahead with his plans. It was a great condition, but they had to know the truth. Jessica and Patrick were reluctant to agree, but once Ken started telling them what had happened the night before, they understood what he meant. He told them about the phone number he had found at the station and the car that picked him up as well. He even talked about who he had met that night. They couldn't believe it. It was a lot to hear everything at once for Patrick and Jessica. There were still a lot of questions to ask, but everyone knew one thing was for sure. The police should not be involved. For her son's safety, it was important for the police to stay out of it. But it was too late. Police may have returned to the station, but an officer was not done with the case yet. He felt that something was wrong with the investigation. Why had Ken just come back with a false story, too? What was the boy hiding? The officer couldn't let it go, so he went and looked into the evidence book just like Ken had done. One of the most common practices in cases like Ken's was to contact the missing person's mobile phone provider. This way, the police could see if they had called anyone recently or if they had received any calls. While they had already found Ken, the officer had checked his phone just in case, and the number he found was about to become important. The number in the test book was the same as the officer had found. The number had been called the night before Ken disappeared. Ken and whoever was on the other end of the phone had talked for more than an hour. Whoever it was, probably, would have the information about where Ken went. The officer had to know. Upon calling the number, the officer was shocked when they answered after just one ring. The person on the other end of the line was very confused and sounded like an old man. Apparently, he didn't expect anyone to call him on this number again. At least, not since Ken called. Who was this old man? The officer had a long conversation with the old man, just as Ken had done, and learned a lot about the situation Ken was in. Knowing that his involvement could complicate things for both Ken and the old man, the officer had to pause and think about what to do next. But in the end, he decided he couldn't be left out of this. That same day, Ken received a call from the old man on the mysterious number. This time, Ken told his parents. He explained everything that was about to happen. And while they didn't like it, one thing was for sure. The police would most likely come looking for him the next day. Patrick tried to dissuade Ken, but Jessica stopped him. They had already agreed not to get in the way. If they wanted their son back, they had to stay calm and let it all come out. And Ken agreed. It was time for everyone to get some answers and some justice as well. Ken left that night and returned the next morning with some bruises. Shortly after he had arrived home, the officer who had further investigated the case was there to take him to the station. Ken didn't resist. Jessica and Patrick were more than worried, but they knew this had to happen. It would be the best thing in the end. The next 2 days went by like a blur, not only for Patrick and Jessica, but for everyone. The couple tried to keep up with everything that was going on with Ken, but things were going very fast. It was becoming clear that Ken's life was changing dramatically, but was it for the better? It became clear that Ken stayed with Patrick and Jessica for a reason. As they received more and more updates, they knew why they had left it on their doorstep, but the answer wouldn't have come to them without the help of the old man behind the mysterious number. But who was the old man? As it was, the old man was a retired police officer who had worked on Ken's case when Patrick and Jessica first encountered him. Unknown to everyone, including his fellow officers, he had figured out why Ken had fallen behind. But he didn't have any proof, so he couldn't do anything about it. I just needed time and some help. The old man had put his number in the evidence book and hoped that if anyone reinvestigated the case, they would call him. After all, anyone who was researching the book of evidence would likely have new information or a discovery that could help. As it was, Ken didn't have any, but he had a different idea. The only evidence the old man had at the time was a phone call from a woman claiming to be the mother of the baby he had left behind. I had never wanted the baby abandoned, but I had no choice. She wanted the man's help to get her baby back, so she went to visit her. The old man had gone to his house, but once he got there, he found himself in a different situation. He asked the woman about the baby, and she said she didn't have a baby and didn't know anything about it. The old man noticed that she looked terrified, and that her husband was constantly by her side. It was obvious to the old man what had happened. The husband had been the one who abandoned the baby, and the woman was now too scared to try to retrieve her baby with him nearby. Unfortunately, the old man didn't have any proof of this, so he had to drop the case, but he left the phone number and it worked. Ken had found the number and called him. Between him and the old man, they were sure they could track down the woman and perhaps help her get away from her husband. The old man and Ken went to confront the couple, and things got complicated very quickly. Luckily for them, help arrived. Ken and the old man showed up at the couple's house. It was a miracle that they had not moved. As soon as the woman saw the retired officer and Ken by her side, she knew that was her son. Her husband, Ken's real father, was very angry. He and Ken began to argue, and soon they were fighting. The woman and the old man couldn't do much to stop them, but the officer who had been investigating the case arrived at the scene just in time before anyone was seriously injured. Ken was left with some bruises, as was the woman's husband. As it was, the officer had investigated the situation further and had come to help. She called for reinforcements, and another policeman took her husband. Ken would also have to be arrested, for the time being, as the husband was filing charges. The officer was kind enough to let Ken come home and explain things to his parents before taking him to the station. But things would have to be clarified soon. The officer interviewed everyone until he was sure he had all the facts. Ken would not be charged with assault, as he was closer to self-defense. The woman admitted that she had been trapped in an abusive relationship with her husband, and that Ken had just arrived to help free her. It was a rescue attempt. Her husband was locked up, and Ken was reunited with his birth mother. Jessica and Patrick were grateful that Ken spoke to them again. He loved them very much, and wanted to remain their son, but he also remembered that he should spend time with his birth mother. Ken finally had all the answers he was looking for.